Now, next part. It's not an accessory you buy actually. We have to fit a knocking point on, because obviously there's no fixed position on the string of where the arrow should be, and without that we've got no chance of having consistent shooting. So there are a few different gadgets you can get for doing knocking points. What we call them is it's a D-loop. So we're going to add a knocking point on, which is simple as it sounds. It's just a bit of serving either side to mark the point on the string where you're going to knock the arrow. And then after we've done that, we fit a loop onto the string. Because we're going to shoot with a release aid, not with our fingers, the release aid clips onto a loop. So there are some fancy loops you can buy, metal ones, machined ones and all sorts, but really the best, most forgiving one is one that you tie on yourself. This does take a little bit of practice. Now, starting with some serving thread, I'm just going to tie a little loop off. Now, I'm not actually going to measure the position other than my own judgment of what I consider a 90-degree position of the arrow on the string. Because when we come to tune the bow, there is no guaranteed position where the arrow will be on the string that's going to suit everybody. Because how the arrow flexes, the technique of the archer, there are too many other factors that influence the position of the knocking point. So what we're achieving here is just a good starting point. But the starting point will never be below 90 degrees to the bowstring. So if you set your starting point down here, that's bad. You're never going to achieve anything good with that, because the back of the arrow is going to strike the bow as you shoot it. So the starting position should be either 90 degrees or up to 4 or 5 millimeters above 90 degrees. So that's the tolerance that we're playing with, 90 degrees and above, never 90 degrees and below. So my judgment with my eagle eyes puts that slightly above 90 degrees. And remember, we can adjust this easily once I've tied this on. So the serving that I'm using is from a company called BCY. It's an American bowstring manufacturer. And it's not just cotton, it's actually quite hard wearing. When I tie it off, I'm going to melt down the ends just to secure it, so I'm not going to use glue. And this particular material melts quite nicely, so it's a good material to use. So I'm just doing a loop over on the top, loop on the bottom, loop on the top, and then you finish with a standard knot. So I've got a row of 3 rings of serving there, and pop the arrow off. Now, to be a bit careful with this as well, because I'm going to melt down the ends of the serving rather than using glue. I prefer not to use glue on strings if we can avoid it, but actually a tiny little dot of super glue, if you're having problems with it coming undone, just on the knot itself would be okay. But if you use super glue on the string itself, that can melt the string and that can be a disaster. So I don't advise using glue. So although this might look a bit dangerous, it's safer than using glue, believe it or not. So I'm going to just, with care, just melt down the end. And why I like this material, because it melts nicely into little bobbin. It doesn't melt extremely fast or hard. It's not hard to do. You just bend it over. So we've got the top knocking point set. I'll just make a double check on the position of that. So you probably can't pick it up on the camera, I'm not sure, but that arrow is slightly above 90 degrees, just as a visual line, slightly high, which is perfect to start with. There are devices you can buy to measure this position, so if you're really not confident about that, it's called a bracing height gauge, clips on the string, and you can measure a 90-degree angle. So that was the top one done. Now I'm going to do the bottom position as well. Now, because the arrow can still slide down. There we go. So that's the knocking point set. Now the reason I like the tie on knocking points is when we come to tune it, if we do have to move these, they act a bit like a nut on a thread, so you can actually wind the knocking points up and down. So it's quite a convenient way of adjusting. The other thing to notice when you make knocking points is that you don't compress the top and bottom knocking point too tightly on the knock of the arrow. So what you need is just a little bit of movement up and down. If anything, that's probably a little bit too much, so I'm going to tighten that up a bit. But the reason we need a small gap, we need the arrow to be able to move up and down on the string as a guide. But if you have the knocking points too tight, so they're compressing the knock, when you draw the string back, the string distorts and turns into a slight V shape, and it actually squashes the knocking points even tighter against the knock. So the knock needs to be free on the string, it needs to be able to disconnect itself quickly and smoothly, and if it squashes, obviously it's going to cause us inconsistencies. So I'm just going to move the gap a little bit tighter by twisting this up the string. Oh, wrong way. So there's probably a millimetre of upwards and down movement on that, but it's free in different angles. I mean, it's actually resting itself there now, but you need this degree of motion to know that your knock's not going to be distorted when you shoot.
For more information on the Bear Anarchy Bow, visit beararcheryproducts.com. Subscribe to Team Wild TV for the best hunting, gear, airgun and now bow hunting videos on YouTube.